Thank you, Manny. That was interesting. Well, as Hermes mentioned, today is Palm Sunday. It's the Sunday before Easter. And he asked me to give a message that's appropriate for this day. In the Christian calendar, this day is traditionally used to remember when Jesus came into Jerusalem riding on a donkey, and he was greeted as the King of Israel. As the people sang Hosanna and they waved the palm branches. My first thought was, when he asked me, was that I don't have anything new to say about this triumphal entry. I gave a sermon on this a few years ago, and well, I don't have anything to add to that. Maybe I could give it again. But I went to the Bible, read the story again in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and each of them give different details about what happened. And I asked about each of them, well, what's the point? Why was the author inspired to include those particular details? Why was he inspired to include the story at all? Now, what's the point for us today? What's the lesson for me and for all of NewLife? And it shouldn't have been a surprise that it was, but there is indeed something new in the story. I'm not going to give an old message, but a new one. So our passage today comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 19, verses 28 through 44. In this chapter, Jesus has just told the parable of the 10 minas, or the parable of the pounds. Verse 28. After Jesus had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. As he approached Bethphage and Bethany at the hill called the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' tell them, 'The Lord needs it.'" Those who were sent ahead went and found it just as he had told them. As they were untying the colt, its owners asked them, "Why are you untying the colt?" They replied, "The Lord needs it." There are a couple of things going on in the passage that are worth mentioning here. First, it's the ancient custom that people of royalty had the right to borrow things from citizens. Even in the modern world, in times of war, the government has the right to requisition property that is needed in the war, just as they have the right to draft people, force them into the army. The idea is that if they lose the war, you aren't going to have that property anyway. In ancient Judea, the Roman soldiers could conscript labor from the people, forcing them to carry their packs for a mile. And here it seems that Jesus is conscripting the service of what Luke calls a colt. The other Gospels tell us this was the colt of a donkey, but Luke doesn't happen to tell us that. He just calls it a colt, a young animal that no one had ever ridden. So the disciples take it, and as Mark tells us in his account, they promise to bring it back. The other thing I'd like to mention is that Luke doesn't tell us how Jesus knew what was going to happen. One possibility is that this is supernatural knowledge. Jesus simply knew ahead of time what the disciples would see and what they would be asked. Well, that's possible. The other possibility is that Jesus made arrangements ahead of time. He had already obtained permission for that donkey to be there and for the disciples to take it. Sometimes we think the disciples were with Jesus 100% of the time, and he wouldn't have had any time on his own in which to make that kind of arrangement. But, we catch glimpses in the Gospels that Jesus was sometimes on his own, and perhaps on one of those occasions, he made arrangements for this donkey. Well, we really don't know. The Bible doesn't make much of a fuss about it, either as an example of miraculous knowledge or as an example of advanced planning. But the point, either way, is that Jesus is in charge. His entry into Jerusalem is not an accident. Jesus, just as he knew that he would be betrayed, he also knew what would happen with his donkey. But there is another odd thing about the story, and that's the fact that it's here not just once, but twice. Jesus tells the disciples what's going to happen, and then Luke repeats all the details to tell us that it happened just as Jesus said. Luke isn't in the habit of wasting words. He's quite skilled at skipping over months with hardly a mention. But here he devotes a considerable amount of space to something that really didn't take very long. And the people who analyze literature and literary techniques say that dialogue gives extra emphasis to a story. And here we have this dialogue twice. Jesus tells the disciples exactly what's going to be said and exactly what they should say. And then Luke tells us exactly what was said and exactly what the disciples said in response. The story is basically told twice. And Luke could have easily ended this part of the story by saying in verse 32, it happened just as Jesus said. But he goes on to tell us in verses 33 and 34 what he had already told us. My guess is he does this because he wants us to think about it. Well, what do you think? Now that you've had a chance to think about it. What do you think? One clue that I see here is that the story emphasizes not just getting the donkey, but untying it. Jesus tells us that the donkey is originally tied up, and then the story tells us 4 times that the donkey is untied. Now, this in the Gospel of Luke, Luke has already used this word. In chapter 13, he's in front of the Pharisees, and he has just healed a crippled woman on the Sabbath. In verse 15, he asks, "Don't each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out to give it water?" It's a rhetorical question. Well, of course they do that. It's just part of daily life in ancient Judea. But in the next verse, Jesus applies that principle to the situation at hand. That's the woman who's just been healed. He says, "Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what bound her?" When Jesus says, "be set free," he is using the same word for untie. The woman was tied up for 18 years, and in healing her, Jesus had untied her and set her free. The Message Bible puts it like this: "Isn't it all right for me to untie this daughter of Abraham and lead her from the stall where Satan has tied her these 18 years?" So the Message is a paraphrase, but in this case it is more literal than the other translations, because it talks about untying the woman. So there's an analogy that Jesus is making here between untying an animal and setting people free from whatever's been tying them down, or holding them down, restricting them. So we can go back to this donkey in Luke 8:19, where Luke tells us 4 times that the donkey's being untied. And I see there an analogy. I'm not sure if that's what Luke intended, but here goes. Jesus is going to Jerusalem for the purpose of setting people free. And later, he sends his disciples out into villages to set people free. They will go into villages and see people who need to be set free from physical problems and spiritual problems that weigh them down. And if anybody asks, "Why are you setting people free from their burdens and the rules that we use to keep them under control?" How are the disciples to answer? The Lord needs them. Now, we are the donkeys. And Jesus sent his servants to untie us. But that doesn't mean that we should now go out and wander in the wilderness. No, the Lord needs us. He has work for us to do. Of course, in one sense, the Lord doesn't need us at all. He didn't really need the donkey either. He could have easily walked into Jerusalem just like everybody else did. But he chose to use that donkey for a purpose. And that's what he's doing with us as well. He wants to use us. He's got a job for us. He's the king and the rightful owner of us. And he has the right to untie us and to conscript us for his own use. He's drafting us, freeing us from sin and death, not to be on our own, but because he wants to use us in his work. He has a job for us. What kind of job? Well, that brings me to part 2 of the sermon. Let's go back to Luke 19 and see what Jesus did with the donkey. Verse 35. They brought it to Jesus, threw their cloaks on the colt, and put Jesus on it. As he went along, people spread their cloaks on the road. When he came near the place where the road goes down to the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of disciples began joyfully to praise God in loud voices for all the miracles they had seen. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest. Peace in heaven. Well, of course there's peace in heaven. And of course there's glory in the highest. These are not requests for something that people hope will happen in the future. They're words of praise for something that was already true. And when the people say, blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, they're not talking about some hypothetical time in the future. They're saying that it is happening right there before their eyes. Jesus is the King they had long awaited. And he is right now on that donkey, coming in the name of the Lord, sent by God to take charge. They're quoting Psalm 118. This is what is called a royal psalm. It celebrates Israel's victory over their enemies. And it was typically sung every year by the Jews who were going to Jerusalem to worship at the festivals. Rome got kind of nervous when they sang this song because it was a nationalistic song. It's like singing the national anthem even after the country's been taken over by somebody else. And several parts of this psalm are identified in the New Testament as being about Jesus. And since it is a song, a lot of people would have memorized it. And if you said one part of it, they would think of the rest of it too, with all of the nationalistic overtones. And since they knew the whole psalm, I think it might be helpful for us to read the whole thing very quickly to help us get the context in which the crowd of disciples was praising Jesus. Psalm 118, verse 1. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Now, you folks are Israel. Verse 2. Let Israel say,
his love endures forever.
All right. Let the house of Aaron say,
his love endures forever.
let those who fear the Lord say,
his love endures forever.
Verse 5. In my anguish, your part's not over yet. He answered by setting me free. The Lord is with me. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? This is quoted in Hebrews 13:5. The Lord is with me. He will be my helper. I will look in triumph on my enemies. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in man. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in princes. All the nations surrounded me. And here's another refrain. But in the name of the Lord, I cut them off. They surrounded me on every side.
But in the name of the Lord, I cut them off.
They swarmed around me like bees, but they died out as quickly as burning thorns.
In the name of the
Lord, I cut them off. I was pushed back and about to fall, but the Lord helped me. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. Shouts of joy and victory resound in the tents of the righteous. Okay, you righteous people?
The Lord's right hand doth done mighty things.
The Lord's right hand is lifted high. The
Lord's right hand doth done mighty
things. I will not die, but live, and I will proclaim what the Lord has done. The Lord has chastened me severely, but He has not given me over to death. Open for me the gates of righteousness. I will enter and give thanks to the Lord. This is the gate of the Lord, through which the righteous may enter. I will give thanks, for you answered me. You have become my salvation. The stone the builders rejected has become the capstone. And that's quoted in the Gospels as being about Jesus. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. We sang that. Verse 25, Lord, save us! Hosanna! We sang that too. The people sang that, according to Matthew, Mark, and John. Lord, grant us success. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. They praise Jesus with that. From the house of the Lord we bless you. The Lord is God, and He has made His light shine on us. With boughs in hand, join the festal procession up to the horns of the altar. In some churches, they have the children have a little parade on Palm Sunday, carrying palm branches, sometimes made out of paper, but to help involve the children in Palm Sunday as we greet Jesus as our King. You are my God, verse 28 says, I will give you thanks. You are my God, and I will exalt you. And the last verse is, give thanks to the Lord, for He is good. Right, thank you. This parade that Jesus was in was similar to others in the ancient world. Whenever a king came to visit a city, the people would come out to greet him and would cheer and sing as he came toward the gate. Whenever a king had won a big battle, he would return to the city with a parade of cheering people. This was not a spontaneous thing. It was organized in advance. Had to make sure that it was a big deal. When Jesus is coming into Jerusalem, the people are greeting Him as a victorious king. Well, the people had a big misunderstanding about what kind of king Jesus is and what He would do. We know that, and Jesus knew that, and Luke knew that too. But he still included this story in the gospel because he knows that Jesus is indeed a king. The people might have misunderstood the job description, but they had the right word. Jesus is indeed a victorious king, but He is not coming here to defeat the Roman armies, but to defeat a much bigger enemy, sin and death. The Romans will eventually go away. The empire will eventually collapse, be replaced by a different one. The Romans will suffer defeat, not at the hands of Jesus, but sin and death will defeat them. They are the biggest enemies. And Jesus has come to defeat the biggest enemies of all. He has come to untie us, to release us from our captivity, to set us free so that we might serve Him. And the people were doing the right thing, even if for the wrong reason. They were throwing their cloaks on the ground. If you want an allegory there, you could say they were getting rid of our old filthy garments and were giving them to Jesus. He will give us robes of righteousness. Not something we can earn, but something that's given to us as a gift. By the grace of God. That's the only way that we can be saved. To give up any claims of our own righteousness and seek to be clothed in Jesus Christ. So our lives are hidden in Him. We are to put off the old garments so we can put on the new garments given to us by Jesus. And we are to greet Jesus with shouts of acclamation. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. We are to greet Jesus as our King. Hail, Jesus, you're our King. We will do as you say. We are the donkey, and you may use us as you wish. Part 3, verses 39 and 40. Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." "I tell you," he replied, "if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out." The Pharisees knew that this little parade was influenced by nationalism. They knew that the crowd of disciples was proclaiming Jesus as king. And they knew that the Romans wouldn't be very happy about that. They knew that the crowd could get out of hand, and the Romans could get out of hand too. Thousands of people could get killed. This is like being in modern Iran and the crowd starts chanting, "Bring back the Shah." In some countries, people like that just disappear and are never seen again. In ancient Rome, their bodies were put on display. There was no question as to what happened to people who started rebellions against Rome. And the Pharisees were anxious to avoid that sort of problem for Jerusalem. So they said, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples. Tell them to stop." And what did Jesus say? If they keep quiet, the stones will cry out. If the people don't proclaim me as king, then somebody else is going to do it because I am the king. If nobody will do it, the stones will. Or he could have borrowed an incident from the Old Testament and said, if the people don't do it, the donkey will speak. And that brings the story back to us because we are the donkeys. Jesus has a job for us, and our job is to proclaim him as king. We need to cry out to let people know that Jesus is king. He has won the victory over sin and death. He's the Savior who will bring heavenly peace and greatest glory. As disciples, this is what we should proclaim. And some people say, "Oh, if I don't do it, then the stones will do it." That lets me off the hook, doesn't it? Let the stones do it. They'll probably do a better job than I would. I don't think that that's the right way to apply what Jesus is saying here. His point really isn't that the stones will do it, but that his disciples ought to be doing it. That's the job we were called to do. Sure, God can raise up stones to do the job, but that doesn't mean that one group of disciples can retire. It means that they're fired. Disciples who don't do what they're supposed to do aren't disciples. Part 4, verse 41. As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone upon another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you." Now this shows us what kind of king Jesus is. He knows that the city is going to reject him. What kind of peace do they need? They need two kinds: political peace and spiritual peace. They need peace with God, reconciliation, and that's what Jesus has come to provide. And it's ironic because the problem is the source of the solution. It's precisely because the people aren't at peace with God, that they aren't at peace with Jesus, and they kill him and unwittingly they are providing a sacrifice that does indeed give them what they need most, and that's peace with God. But they couldn't see what would bring them peace, either with God or with Rome. They thought they had a riot on their hands, and their approach to peace was to kill the leader of the crowd. And that's Jesus. As the Gospel of John tells us, they thought it was better that one person should die than for the whole nation to be thrown into war. So they arranged to have him killed in order to save the nation. And ironically, that's exactly what happened. By his death, he saved the nation and all the other nations as well. But the Jewish leaders were seeking to save their own lives, and they ended up losing them because they didn't have peace with God, because they didn't know the ways of God. They sought merely a physical peace, a military peace. And they were building on the wrong foundation. They lost even that, what they were seeking. The nation rebelled and Rome came in. And just as Rome had done to many cities before, they built an embankment around the city and besieged it on every side. It was a bloodbath. They killed thousands and took all the survivors back to Rome as slaves. They didn't leave one stone on another. They wanted the city to be an example of what happens to cities that rebel against Rome. And Jesus saw it coming, and he wept over the city. It was because they didn't recognize the time of God's coming. Jesus was there before them. The disciples were proclaiming him as king, and the leaders wouldn't listen. People who refuse God's way and rely on human methods end up failing, because human methods don't work. People who reject spiritual peace are on the wrong path. They're eventually going to suffer a loss of political peace too. The people didn't understand what God was doing in their own generation, and Jesus wept. And I wonder, how often do we weep? How often do I weep? Over people who don't understand what they're doing. They don't recognize what Jesus has done for them. They're going down the path that will bring them more trouble, both spiritually and physically. Well, maybe somebody else will tell them. Maybe the stones will cry out, or maybe the donkeys will speak. Well, I don't know. Jesus will take care of it, won't he? He died for them. Won't he make sure that they find out? Can't he get the stones to tell everyone? Well, yes, but he shouldn't have to. Some people say that God will make sure that everyone will have a fair opportunity to learn about what Jesus has done for them. There's no need to be concerned about them today, because God will take care of them all later. Our understanding of God does lead us to believe that he'll be fair, and I think that's right. I don't know exactly how he's going to do it, but Jesus knows, and he wept. Jesus conquered their spiritual enemies. He paid for all their sins. He had won a huge victory over death, and yet he wept. Because they didn't recognize it. They didn't know it. They didn't accept it or believe it. And they continued living as if they were still tied up and bound by the chains of sin. And they were going down a path that would bring them more pain. Maybe if we knew what Jesus knew, maybe we would weep too. And maybe we'd be more interested in supporting the work of the gospel. There's a song we sang, says, "Break my heart for what breaks yours." Okay, let's review. First, we are a donkey. Jesus has set us free because he has need of us. He's got something for us to do. Second, as disciples, we are supposed to proclaim Jesus as King. He is our King, and our job is to do what he wants us to do. Third, if we don't proclaim him King, Jesus will find somebody else to do it. He wants to make sure that it gets done. And last, this is not necessarily a fun job. We're supposed to care about other people. And we really care that some of them don't know what makes for peace. So today is Palm Sunday, in which we remember Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. He's on his way to victory over sin and death, a victory that we can share in. And so we rejoice. We proclaim him as King. But even in our triumph, even in our joy, we also remember that not everyone shares in the triumph. Some are still held captive because they don't know yet. And our work as a church is to let more people know.